How's it going, everybody? It's Juansgalt, and I'm very excited about this video. I've been a big fan of Namecoin for a long time, and I was thrilled to hear recently that there's a group of developers that are moving it forward. This is an interview with Jeremy Rand. He's the most public sort of core dev or leading dev of Namecoin right now, and we're gonna get right into sort of what is Namecoin, the history of it. It is the only other coin that I'm aware of that Satoshi actually contributed to as the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, and it squares Zooko's triangle. Is the magic of it. For those that are technical about that, for those that are not, it's about the domain name system on top of a decentralized blockchain. So we're gonna get into all the details. Before we do that, I just want to bring two things to your attention real quick. I'm gonna be at Acapulco February 14th till the 17th, I think it is. It's a big anarchist conference. You guys have heard about it. No Bitcoin.com sponsorship this year, I believe. So it's going to be an interesting time, regardless of whether you want to go to the speeches or not, which there's some really big names this year. I think Judge Napolitano is going to be there. Ron Paul is going to be there. Big names in the libertarian space. But also just the people that I've met there are some of the best people that I've ever met. A lot of good people, a lot of very curious, interesting, sort of innovative people. They're all in the fringes. I always like an Acapulco, and I always have a great time, even though I'm mostly just floating around doing my own thing. And I also have a very special project that I'll be launching there, helping people claim and maintain their cryptographic sovereignty in their crypto wealth. So you'll be hearing more about that soon. There's a discount link below for 10% for an Acapulco tickets, so check that out. And I just want to also let you guys know about the private key day, claim your private keys day. I think that's what it's called. This is a movement by Trace Mayer, something that he's promoting on January the 3rd, which is the Genesis block day, the day that Bitcoin blockchain officially started churning and doing its magic. That was January 3rd, 2009, and during that day we're going to launch a holiday where we basically reclaim the Bitcoin that we put on exchanges. Okay, it's a way for us to practice having the sovereignty over our keys, and a way to test that the exchanges are actually doing full reserve and not fractional reserve. Because if they're doing fractional reserve, then that's an instability that we don't want to end up in. So that's very interesting holiday, very important. I'm going to be pushing it. A lot of other people are pushing it. So check that out. Stay tuned to that and participate in this sort of this holiday, right? What's the point of crypto if we're going to trust a third party that's going to be doing fractional reserve, and we don't know if they're accountable, and they're even less sort of restricted with their powers than normal banks, right? So let's do some self-governance, some self-accountability, and withdraw our funds for one day, and you can put them back in afterwards if you want, if you're going to be trading them. But learn how to hold your own money, and then let's see if they actually have all that money. It's going to be a very exciting day, whether you join it or not, so better play ball. Okay, so the website where you can find all the details is called proofofkeys.com. That's proofofkeys.com. And that's it. Let us know what you think. It's a fascinating project, and I thought it was a great conversation. Looking forward to your thoughts in the comments. Enjoy. How's it going, everybody? It's Juansgalt with Crypto TV. I have a very special guest today. I'm with Jeremy Rand, one of the core developers of Namecoin. Namecoin is one of the earliest fork of Bitcoin. It may be the only other coin that Satoshi actually contributed to, under the Satoshi name, and it's focused on providing a censorship-resistant, decentralized distributed DNS to IP routing, as far as I understand it. Like it's sort of like a DNS, sort of domain name system that's sort of separate from the current way that the internet works, and it's doesn't require trust and authority to function. Jeremy, how are you doing?
Good.
Awesome. So thank you for coming on. Why don't you tell us a little bit about maybe a basic introduction, like the elevator pitch of what Namecoin is. We'll talk a little bit more about the history and what's going on in the future of it. And then maybe we can get into what how maybe you can explain to us sort of how the DNS system works more or less right now, so people understand what problems Namecoin is trying to solve.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so your introduction was quite good. Yeah, so Namecoin, as you said, it's basically a decentralized alternative to the DNS. This has some useful benefits. For example, it's relatively resistant to censorship, such as domain name seizures. On the technical level under the hood, it's basically an exact copy of Bitcoin with a few minor changes. The most major change is that the coins, or what you might think of as coins, represent domain names rather than fungible units of currency. And this is basically just done by attaching a little bit of extra data to the coin outputs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reading up some of the early posts that Satoshi makes. I was trying to figure out what the history of it was exactly. And sorry about that. Somebody's ringing the doorbell. I was trying to figure out the history of it. And sorry, we'll edit this out.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so I was trying to figure out sort of some of the early history, and there's some really interesting posts. So the way that the mining works in Bitcoin, we usually think of it as like, you're mining, you're doing proof of work, and you get as a reward some units of account in Bitcoin. Is it the same thing? Like you get units of account in Namecoin, but there's extra space, like you can assign a domain name to per unit, or is it something more complicated?
So the original proposal back when the project was called BitDNS, which was proposed by Apamato on the Bitcoin Talk forum, the original proposal was that when you mined a block, you would get to create some domain names directly. And that design approach was basically shot down by the community for usability reasons, because it would mean that in order to actually register a name, you would have to mine a block, and that would presumably cause a lot of delay, or it might incentivize a market where miners would become trusted third parties registering domains for people. And so what was suggested instead, and if I recall correctly, Thamos proposed this, was that instead of mining domain names directly, you would mine a cryptocurrency, which is similar in design to Bitcoin, and then later you could convert units of that currency into domain names. And so that's the design that Namecoin ended up going with. So when you mine a Namecoin block, you receive a block reward of Namecoins, which is cryptocurrency. The abbreviation is NMC. And later you can issue special transaction types that convert units of NMC into an actual domain name. And that process is irreversible. So once you've created a domain name, you can't convert that back into Namecoin currency.
Okay. And just to get some of the basics out, how many Namecoins can there be? What's the supply like?
You're asking about the inflation schedule, things like that? Yeah. So the inflation schedule is identical to that of Bitcoin, so maximum of 21 million Namecoins. And given that registering a domain name in Namecoin requires destroying one name cent, so you do the math, that comes out to, you get about, 2.1 billion names can ever be registered in the system. And given that the DNS right now has something like, I think about 300 million names, that can work. It's not clear exactly how well the supply-demand curve is going to work out on that. It's kind of an experiment.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this is not Namecoin is not expected to be sort of like this kind of store of value, right? Like a lot of the cryptocurrencies today, like, and over the past few years, they're all trying to be the same thing. But I think the reality is Bitcoin, I think, is going to break away from this sort of, valuation path of a lot of the other projects. And, something like Monero, for example, or Namecoin will definitely, I think, if things go well, they'll acquire a value that is stable and good, but it's not going to be something astronomical like what Bitcoin might acquire as a store of value.
Right.
One of the interesting things about Namecoin is that it's actually merged mine on Bitcoin's proof of work SHA-256 algorithm. Is that that's been the case since the conception of Namecoin. Is that going well? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. When Namecoin was first proposed, back when the project was called BitDNS, the initial thinking was that Namecoin would basically be part of the Bitcoin blockchain, and the idea was that you would have Bitcoin, BitDNS, and maybe some other use cases as well, and it would all be in one big blockchain. And the original proposal by Appomatto referred to that large blockchain as BitX. And Satoshi really wasn't a fan of that idea. And he basically said, I think the quote is, piling every proof of work quorum system into one data set doesn't scale. And he elaborated by basically saying that, if someone who only wants to use Bitcoin, they don't want to have to download all of the BitDNS data in order to validate the Bitcoin blockchain's correctness, and vice versa. And so what Satoshi proposed was, instead of having everything in one blockchain, you could have multiple blockchains, but they would share the proof of work. And so Satoshi described a system which is basically merged mining. And interestingly, when Namecoin was first released, it actually didn't have merged mining in it. It was completely its own blockchain, but it used the same proof of work algorithm as Bitcoin. And so this produced some problems early on, especially when someone who I think was a little bit short-sighted noticed that at some point, hey, you can actually make more profit by mining Namecoin than by mining Bitcoin, and posted this on the Bitcoin Talk forum. So of course, lots of miners switched from Bitcoin to Namecoin up until the next difficulty adjustment, at which point Namecoin had a crazy high difficulty and all the miners abandoned it. And that, I think, took months and months for Namecoin to eventually recover from that. It was sort of a more extreme version of the chain hopping incident that happened between Bitcoin and Bcash last year. Mm-hmm. And on that note, I actually think this is a really important reason why both Bitcoin and Bcash should adopt merged mining. I think politically it's not going to happen, but in terms of design soundness, I think both Bitcoin and Bcash would be better off if they both adopted merged mining, because that way they wouldn't be a danger to each other as much.
That's fascinating. Why do you think they haven't adopted merged mining? It seems to be a no-brainer now that we think about it or talking about it.
Yeah, I totally agree that it seems like a no-brainer from a technical perspective. In Bitcoin's case, there actually is a proposal by Luke Dash Jr. to add merged mining to Bitcoin. And in fact, at Namecoin, we would actually really like to see Bitcoin adopt Luke's proposal, mainly because of a technical quirk of how merged mining works right now, which is that, so the way merged mining works right now, the Namecoin block headers have to include the entire Coinbase transaction from the parent block in the Bitcoin chain. And if a mining pool is paying out a large number of miners, that means that Coinbase transaction can be very large. And so the Namecoin block headers are a lot bigger than the 80 bytes that Bitcoin block headers have. And this is frustrating because that means SPV clients have to download all those Coinbase transactions, which uses up a lot of bandwidth and is just annoying. But if Bitcoin and Namecoin were both using merged mining, then the Coinbase transaction, or the analog equivalent of that, would be very, very small because there wouldn't be any miner payouts in that. And so just for that reason alone, I think from Namecoin's point of view, we'd really like to see Bitcoin adopt merged mining. In terms of why Luke's proposal hasn't actually been adopted yet, part of the reason is that it's a hard fork, and hard forks are somewhat disruptive. I think part of the reason, and I'm just speculating here, is that because Luke works with Blockstream, and because there's a lot of FUD about, Blockstream is trying to, take over the Bitcoin ecosystem or, BS like that. I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to any hard fork proposal that is supported by anyone from Blockstream, and that's unfortunate because Blockstream does really good work.
Yeah, they do very good work, and I don't think that we'll ever see another hard fork in Bitcoin unless it's some sort of like even the inflation bug that happened recently. Like there's an update to the software, and like as far as I know, it's still a minority of nodes that, as far as like numbers that have actually updated to the new. So it's very hard to do a hard fork on Bitcoin now.
Yeah.
So that might not happen that way, but it would be great to see merge mining sort of catch a little bit more popularity.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I mean, from my point of view, my tendency is to think that I think hard forks aren't inherently bad. I think we need more research to figure out the best ways to do a hard fork with the least amount of disruption. Luke's proposal actually has a really cool feature where the merged mining implementation that Luke has in his proposal, it actually makes it does this thing that he calls, I think it's called a soft hard fork. And the way it works is that all of the new blocks that are mined according to that hard fork, they actually, if you load them into a previously existing version of Bitcoin, they actually look like valid blocks. They just have no transactions visible. And so what that means is you don't have the security issue where people who haven't upgraded will end up on an insecure chain with no hash rate. They'll still get the full hash rate. They just won't be able to see any transactions. And so that will be an easy way for them to notice, oh, I should upgrade, and they won't be at risk of one rogue miner taking over the old chain. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of research going on into how to do a hard fork more safely, but at this point, I don't think the research is far enough for Bitcoin to really succeed at doing a hard fork. But I really hope that changes. In terms of politics of hard forks, I think there's nothing wrong with doing hard forks as long as you can't do it easily with a soft fork, and as long as the change is non-controversial. I mean, obviously things like messing with the block size limit, that's controversial. Hard forks aren't a good idea for that. But for something like adding merged mining, which from a technical standpoint is clearly an improvement, my take is there shouldn't be a political problem there. It just comes down to, can you do it safely without disruption?
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating. I haven't heard anybody talk about merge mining in a long while. And Namecoin is one of those projects that it's fascinating what can be possible with this. And yeah, so there seems to be a lot of benefit. I would definitely like to sort of hear more conversation about merge mining. Let me read a quote that I found from Satoshi, and I just tweeted this out, and I have the link sources to the Nakamoto Institute. It says Bitcoin and BitDNS can be used separately. Users shouldn't have to download all of both to use one or the other. BitDNS users may not want to download everything the next several unrelated networks decide to pile in either. The networks need to have separate fates. So this is the idea. You have a sort of kind of shared pool of proof of work with merge mining, and then you have sort of different blockchains, different networks kind of rising out of that, right? And they would be basically, kind of, they have separate fates, but they're using the same foundation, the same soil in a sense. Which is
exactly.
Really interesting. Okay, so tell us a little bit about how DNS and IP routing, how does it or mapping anyway works in the internet today, and where's the trust, where's the authority?
Yeah, sure. So right now, the way the DNS works at the moment is that there's quite a lot of trusted third parties around. Basically, DNS is hierarchical, which some people, for example, people at the IETF like to claim that hierarchical systems are decentralized. I don't think the decentralized term applies to hierarchical systems like the DNS. I think that's just a terminology disagreement there. Basically, as a hierarchical system, there are DNS registrars and DNS registries, and there's the ICANN root zone. So the DNS registrars are the companies that you would directly, for example, buy a domain name from, things like, Namecheap or GoDaddy. Then there's the DNS registries, which are the companies or governments that operate the top-level domains. So, for example, let's see, I can't remember the names of the major registries off the top of my head, but basically those are like the companies that operate .com, .org, things like that. And so the registrars have to follow the rules of the registries, and then the registries follow the rules of the ICANN root zone, which basically coordinates all of the top-level domains. And unfortunately, pretty much any of these entities has the capacity, if not necessarily the interest, in messing with the system. So, for example, if a DNS registrar decides that they don't like a particular domain name, they have the ability to refuse service to that domain name and just cancel it, or at the very least demand that the owner of the domain name move to a different registrar. I'm not sure if they can actually cancel it unilaterally. That probably depends on various jurisdictional issues. And similarly, if a registry decides that a domain name doesn't follow their policies, they can order the registrar to get rid of it. ICANN generally stays out of those things. The only issues that ICANN really has in that area are that ICANN has trademark policies, which all of the registries have to abide by. And so basically, if someone decides that a domain name is violating a trademark, then under ICANN policy, that domain name has to be seized and handed over to whoever has claim to the trademark. So those are the trusted third parties that exist on the side of the domain name owner. On the other side, people who are looking up the domains, they generally have to trust recursive resolvers, which would be things like Google Public DNS or Cloudflare Public DNS or whatever DNS server their ISP is running. And those recursive resolvers can, if they choose to, do malicious stuff there as well. They could, for example, redirect to the wrong IP address or something like that, which is called hijacking. Or they could just say, no, this domain name doesn't actually exist, which would be censorship. Those particular attacks by the recursive resolvers, in theory, they're eliminated by DNSSEC, which is a new standard that it's not even really new. It came out, I think, in the 90s or something like that, but it isn't widely adopted yet. And usually when it is adopted, the validation is done by the recursive resolvers, not by the users. You're still trusting the recursive resolvers to do the DNSSEC validation for you. There is software publicly available, things like DNSSEC Trigger that you can install locally, which will do DNSSEC validation on your own machine. And that's certainly a step up in improvement in terms of whether you're having to trust the recursive resolvers, but you're still trusting the registrars and registries and the ICANN root, even if you have DNSSEC validation installed locally. And so Namecoin differs from this in the sense that it's not a hierarchical system. The consensus mechanism doesn't have any trusted third-party intermediaries in that way. So if you register, I don't know, WikiLeaks.bit, then there's no way for someone else to say, oh, well, we want WikiLeaks.bit assigned to someone else. I mean, that's of course subject to the threat model of the Namecoin network. So, for example, if someone does a 51% attack, then things get a little bit hairier. But for the most part, yeah, if you register a domain name with Namecoin, then no one can seize it. No one can change what it points to. And this might sound primarily like a benefit for things like censorship resistance, but there's actually another really interesting use case that this has, which is public key infrastructure. So for background on this, when you're using protocols like HTTPS, Right now, your web browser is trusting a large number of companies and governments called certificate authorities. And it's trusting them to verify that the website you're talking to is actually the website that you requested. And there was a fairly high-profile case a few years ago where an attacker who may have been an Iranian intelligence agency, they compromised one of the certificate authorities that web browsers trust, and they issued themselves a bunch of malicious fake certificates that allowed them to impersonate a wide variety of entities. They were able to impersonate things like Google and Gmail, Microsoft, Skype, Yahoo, Mozilla, basically a lot of things you probably don't want an Iranian intelligence agency to be able to impersonate. And it was later discovered that some of these certificates that they issued themselves were actually found to be deployed on an Iranian web server, which was probably being used to mass wiretap people in Iran. And so Namecoin can basically sidestep this issue because with Namecoin, you can actually just put a public key hash into your Namecoin record along with the IP address, and that can basically act as a decentralized alternative to certificate authorities. So instead of trusting that a certificate authority has signed the public key that a website presents, instead you just check, does this public key that I'm seeing from the website match what the Namecoin record for the website says should be there? And this idea of using a DNS-like system as a way to improve the security of HTTPS, that's not something Namecoin directly invented. DNSSEC has been proposed to be used for that as well. The spec for that is called DANE, D-A-N-E. But the problem there is that because DNSSEC isn't widely adopted, DANE hasn't really gotten any adoption either. None of the major web browsers supports DANE. Whereas with Namecoin, because we're sort of starting from a clean slate, we're actually able to do some stuff with without worrying about whether DNSSEC is widely deployed. Now, for what it's worth, it'd be a lot easier if DNSSEC were widely deployed, because then we could just use the DANE support that web browsers might have to work with Namecoin, because Namecoin's sort of support for this actually is compatible with how DANE works. But alas, because web browsers don't support DANE, we had to do a lot of really interesting witchcraft to get web browsers to support DANE-like functionality for Namecoin. And honestly, that's kind of the thing that I specialize in at Namecoin. Like, I'd say a majority of the time I spend doing Namecoin development is actually finding interesting ways to rig web browsers to do HTTPS certificate verification with Namecoin without having to fork the source code of the web browser, which would be not very fun to maintain.
Right. Well, thank you for that. That's a fantastic sort of layout of the infrastructure today. I think people will find that what you just said very, very interesting. And the certificate authority seems like a very sort of like a low-hanging fruit, because there's definitely been a lot more scandals, let's say, about certificate authority man-in-the-middle attacks. That's kind of what we're talking about. Just a lot of ways that third parties can intercept and spy on communications or feed you fake data. Like, for example, fake Bitcoin addresses, right? You're trying to sort of buy something and they just intercept and give a different Bitcoin address, and now you have a real problem. And there's one attack that happened like that years ago. I think it was Opaque Coin or some blockchain at some point. It was done on Bitcoin.talk. I don't think it was like a DNS hijack or anything like that, but it was a man-in-the-middle attack. Anyway, so there's a lot of certificate authority kind of examples that we can sort of point to, and obviously there's
on that note, so I mentioned the Iranian intelligence agency attack as a particularly scary example, because Iranian intelligence is scary, but there are actually a lot of other cases where certificate authorities have done horrible screw-ups without even being attacked by an intelligence agency. Just they'll randomly do something stupid and give a certificate to the wrong person. There was one case a couple of years ago where a major certificate authority issued a certificate for GitHub.com to a guy who only was able to prove that he had an account on GitHub. And there was also an incident, also I think a couple of years ago, where on different certificate authority, they were trying to look up the email address that was associated with the domain name so that they could issue the certificate to the owner of that domain name, except they were only able to get an image of the email address, which was, I think, a policy for anti-spam purposes from whoever was providing them that data. And so they automatically did OCR algorithms on the image to try to figure out what email address to mail the certificate to. And their OCR algorithm, I think they confused a 1 for an L. And as a result, they emailed the certificate to the wrong person and issued a false certificate. I mean, this kind of ridiculous screw up happens on a regular basis. And it usually doesn't even take an intelligence agency to trigger it.
That's incredible. So this is great. This is a very clear example of the utility of Namecoin and very important sort of security aspects of the use of the internet today. And there's, maybe millions, billions of dollars at stake, or at least, a lot of money can be lost. A lot of harm can be caused by this kind of man-in-the-middle attacks. And then there's also this whole kind of argument of political censorship, right? I think there's, WikiLeaks is a good example, and obviously kind of Iranian censorship over their own population and all that. It fits very well with the vision of Bitcoin. And it's fascinating that Satoshi, when this topic came up, years ago, he was like, yeah, no, let's not put everything on top of Bitcoin. Let's create a different sort of blockchain for this, and then secure it so that they can have different fates. I think that's really powerful, and people sort of need to kind of go back and consider that. And it's very relevant to kind of some of the crypto drama that sort of we're now kind of getting over. So no, that's fantastic. Okay, let me see. No.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention there's one other really interesting use case that is sort of like a combination of the censorship-resistant DNS and the certificate authority use cases, which is Namecoin can actually act as a human-readable naming layer for things like Tor onion services. Because right now, if you're trying to access a Tor onion service, you have to use a .onion domain name, which is more than 50 characters of pseudo-random base 32, and that's a horrible usability nightmare. And worse, it's a security nightmare as well, because people don't usually check the entire .onion domain when they see it, because it would take too long to check. And so there have been attacks in the wild where people would register partial collisions of existing .onion domains, and then they would try to impersonate other people's .onion domains and actually do things like steal Bitcoin as a result. There was, I think, one of the most interesting cases was I was looking through the Wikipedia history to figure out which .onion domains had ever been mentioned in the history of Wikipedia. And I noticed that someone, back when Silk Road was active, someone had created a malicious copy of the Silk Road website, and they had registered a .onion domain that was very similar for the first, I think, 7 or 8 characters of the official Silk Road onion service, and then they added that malicious .onion domain to the Wikipedia entry on Silk Road, hoping that would attract people to go and get their Bitcoin stolen on this fake Silk Road website. And so it's interesting that this is in some sense a censorship resistance thing, since onion services are also used for censorship resistance, but it's also sort of an anti-hijacking / public key infrastructure use case as well, since onion services have self-authenticating addresses, and using Namecoin as a naming layer for onion services can basically give you both the censorship resistance and the self-authenticating properties that onion services have, but you get a human-readable name.
Yeah, and that's the whole point, as far as I know, of the domain name system, is that nobody can remember an IP address, but a name is something that humans can deal with, right? And so making sure there's secure mapping from the name to the IP addresses is like a fundamental usability feature that has brought the internet to what it is today. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about the history of Namecoin a little bit more. Aaron Swartz, who, people that are familiar with this sort of the history of the internet, this guy is one of the legends, right? Perhaps up there with Satoshi Nakamoto. He was involved with Reddit, the creation of Reddit, RSS, a bunch of different internet sort of protocols that are very useful today. He was also involved with Namecoin. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the history and of his involvement?
Yeah, sure. So there were actually two different parallel designs that both sort of merged into Namecoin. So the first one was, as I said, BitDNS, which was proposed by Appomatto, and the other one was a system called Nakanames, which was proposed by Aaron Swartz. Now, Aaron's proposal, Nakanames, was published a few months after Appomatto's BitDNS proposal was published. And as far as I'm aware, Aaron was not aware of Appomatto's work when he published it. But yeah, basically, Aaron Swartz, from what I understand, he basically had made a bet with Dan Kaminsky that Aaron was thinking, yeah, I think I can solve this Zooko's triangle issue. And Zooko's triangle, of course, is the long-standing conjecture that it's impossible to create a naming system that's simultaneously decentralized, human meaningful, and has a global namespace. The idea was you can only get two out of those three. And Aaron had basically made a bet with Dan Kaminsky saying, yeah, I think I can find a way to get all three of these at once. And then sometime after that bet was made, Aaron Swartz was talking to Dan Kaminsky, and Dan Kaminsky said something about, a currency is sort of a lot like a naming system in a lot of ways. And so that means Zooko's triangle should also apply to Bitcoin. And Aaron initially thought that makes no sense because Bitcoin, it has problems, but it's definitely possible. It clearly shouldn't be covered by Zooko's triangle if Zooko's triangle says it's not possible. And then Aaron realized, wait a minute, that means no, he's right. You actually can apply Zooko's triangle to Bitcoin, and that means that because Bitcoin manages to be a decentralized currency, you actually can modify Bitcoin to solve Zooko's triangle for a naming system as well. And so Aaron wrote up an article on this. I think it was called "Squaring the Triangle," and he basically outlined a very rough proposal for how you might make a Bitcoin-like system that implements a naming system in a way that solves all three of the properties of Zooko's triangle. It would be a human-readable. It would have human-readable names. It would be a global namespace, meaning that a name means the same thing everywhere, and it would be decentralized, unlike the DNS. And there are some conspiracy theories that Aaron may have been the person behind the alias Vincent Durham, who was the founder of Namecoin. My opinion is that's very unlikely. And I can elaborate on why I think that's very unlikely if you're curious. But that said, Aaron definitely did have enough influence on the Namecoin project and the Namecoin developers that at some point we decided to name the fundamental currency unit of Namecoin the Swartz, in the same way that the fundamental currency unit of Bitcoin is the Satoshi.
That's fantastic. We can leave that conspiracy discussion to another call if people are interested. Let us know in the comments below, or anywhere that you can reach us if you're interested in that question. And Aaron Swartz, again, was one of the legends, one of my heroes, and he suffered a horrible fate at the hands of an American prosecutor. So if you're bored and looking for an interesting rabbit hole, look up Aaron Swartz and enjoy losing the next 2 weeks worth of research there. Let's talk about so what happened. So Aaron Swartz, it was gone. R.I.P. Moment of silence for him. And Satoshi was gone as well. What happened there after that? How did let's say you came in the picture, and who has been developing? Like how has the community kind of continued over the years? Since it seems like Namecoin is not in the radar of many people, but it's one of those projects that's kept moving forward. And you appeared recently, at least in my radar, and it seems like you guys are doing very good development, very active development. So how did that come about?
Yeah. So Namecoin was founded by a pseudonymous developer operating under the name Vincent Durham, and Vince basically left the project after about a year or two, similar to how Satoshi left Bitcoin. In fact, and it's interesting. There's a lot of parallels between Namecoin's history and that of Bitcoin, which I think is pretty cool. And so at that point, it was basically up to the community to continue development, just like the community continued Bitcoin development after Satoshi left. And so initially, there was I'd say there has been a lot of churn historically in the set of Namecoin developers, which I guess is something that's to be expected when you have a project which, at least for most of its lifetime, was entirely volunteers. And, there wasn't really a clear monetization path because, Namecoin didn't do the pre-mine BS that ICO shitcoins do these days. And so because there wasn't a clear monetization route, and because, everyone was working as a volunteer or just on donations, people get bored, move on to other things like that. And so, yeah, there's definitely been a lot of developer churn. I think more recently that has improved, in part because we do currently have funding from NLNet Foundation out of the Netherlands. But yeah, so I actually originally joined the Namecoin community just as a user in 2012, so about a year after Namecoin was founded. And it's interesting the way that I actually got involved in development. I had been reading some of the specifications for Namecoin, and I noticed that there was this feature, the HTTPS verification feature that I mentioned earlier. And at the time, it was in a spec, but no one had actually implemented it. And I was like, okay, this seems like a really cool feature. It would be really useful to a lot of people. I'm going to put up a 1 Bitcoin bounty for this. And, at the time, 1 Bitcoin was about $10, so it certainly wasn't enough to pay for anyone's time. But, it was a token gesture. It was the kind of thing that was really common back in the Bitcoin community back then. And after I did that, 2 other users in the Namecoin community basically said, hey, yeah, this seems like a really cool idea. We're also putting in 1 Bitcoin each. So at that point, there was 3 Bitcoins up for grabs, which was about $30. And I waited about a year, and no one stepped up to actually implement it. And at that point, it was I think about June of 2013. I was like, okay, I'm going to try to implement this myself because no one else is doing it. And so I took about a month or so of tinkering around and studying lots of details of how browsers handle HTTPS. And I had run across a really interesting project called Convergence by Moxie Mullenspike, who's probably best known these days for being the developer of Signal. And I realized that Convergence, which was a project by Moxie that basically allowed users to replace the web browser's trusted certificate authority list, basically with a set of notary servers that the user could choose from, I realized that most of the code in that could actually be repurposed to implement HTTPS verification for Namecoin. And so I forked Convergence and made some changes. And after about a month of developing, I actually had a proof of concept working. The code quality wasn't great. It probably had a lot of attack surface compared to the code that we have these days, but it worked. It worked well enough. And so I claimed the bounty. And so I got my 1 Bitcoin back, and I got the 2 Bitcoins from the other 2 people in the community. And as one of those other 2 people was paying me, he said, hey, you should stick around. It was fun. It was fun testing your code. You should keep developing stuff for Namecoin. And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And thus I ended up as a Namecoin developer. And yeah, I've been pretty much leading the HTTPS related use case stuff since then. Although there are some other developers in Namecoin who have contributed a lot of good work to that area as well. Especially people like Ryan Castellucci and Hugo Landau have done some really good work in that area as well. Yeah, so that's how I got involved. And I've been around as a result since 2013. The other developers that are most prominent, I'd say Daniel Kraft is probably the closest thing we have to a lead developer besides me. So Daniel and I tend to be sort of the de facto leaders. Daniel joined development, I think, also around 2013. He was mostly interested in identity use cases, so things like having a naming layer for things like PGP keys or OTR keys or things like that. And he did development in that area for a while. And at some point, I think maybe a year or two after Daniel joined, the guy who was developing the Namecoin core client died of a stroke. Which was horrible. And so Daniel decided to basically take over development of Namecoin Core after that happened. And so as a result, since then, Daniel hasn't had a lot of time to work on the identity use cases. And on that note, if any of your audience is interested in developing stuff with human readable naming for things like PGP keys or other things like that for identity use cases, yeah, we'd love to have help with that. Yeah, and so Daniel and I have basically been sort of effectively co-leading things, although we don't necessarily have leaders per se. Obviously, neither Daniel nor I can make decisions that violate what other people want to do. Other developers have come and gone over time. We have.
Before you move on to another name, on the topic of identity, that's another one of the areas that seems to be, well, that's fascinating to me, and it's obvious that we need a better sort of secure, pseudonymous, cryptographically kind of sound, human readable identity system in the internet. There's a lot of fraud that happens in the internet, a lot of information that gets shared that doesn't need to get shared on the internet. With technologies like this in mind. So identity stuff is great. And yeah, if people work on it, that'd be fantastic. Real quick, are you aware of Keybase, keybase.io? They seem to be kind of working on an identity solution. They're using Bitcoin for authentication, and they're, they have a pretty good platform. They haven't done anything scammy. It's all open source. A lot of it open source anyway. Early OkCupid people. Are you aware of them?
I'm aware of them. I haven't actually studied their system in very much detail. Most of the identity stuff is pretty much out of my realm. I pretty much stay busy enough dealing with HTTPS stuff as well as the lightweight clients that I work on. So it's not exactly my area of specialty, so I haven't studied them in detail. I've heard some good things about them. It's not clear to me exactly how trustless they really are. Yeah, I tend to think that that a consensus protocol like Namecoin may be able to provide some functionality or support for threat models that more centralized systems like that aren't really best suited to. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly lots of possible approaches to this kind of thing. And yeah, I think it's good that people are exploring lots of different approaches.
Yeah, that's great. I'll share this on the Keybase general chat. See what people think.
Okay.
Okay. Any other last thoughts on that? I'd like to move on to some of the myths around Namecoin. That'd be good to clarify.
Let's see. In terms of other things, let's see. Yeah. So there's going to be a couple of Namecoin developers, including me, at the 35C3 conference in Leipzig later this month in December. And I think, I'm not certain yet, I think we're going to have a pretty cool announcement that's going to be made there. I'm going to be giving a talk hosted by the Monero Assembly at 35C3. And I think we're going to have a pretty cool announcement for some new software we've been working on that hasn't been announced yet.
Awesome. Can't wait to see that. Stay tuned on the Namecoin News website. Well, if you go to namecoin.org, I believe you can see some of the news, right?
Yeah, namecoin.org.
Okay, great. So one of the common myths that I hear about Namecoin is that a lot of domains got squatted, and so the domain name part of it has been kind of, they've been all bought up and you can't find the ones that are useful anymore. But I believe there's an expiration date, and that's not really the case anymore. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So first off, I should note that in practice, it's extremely rare for me to want to register a name and discover that someone else already has it. So in practice, I don't think that nearly as many names are squatted as people like to claim. In addition to that, yeah, there definitely are some names that are squatted, but in practice, most of the names that are squatted, they list a contact information in them. Usually it's things like a bit message address, something like that. And what I've heard from multiple people who have tried this, as well as when I've tried this, is if there's a name that's squatted and you want it, if you just contact the person who owns it, it is very likely that they'll give it to you for free, as long as your plan is to use it for an actual website rather than to resell it. For example, we have a community member who maintains an unofficial Russian language website about Namecoin. That website is bitname.ru. And he was looking to get the domain name bitname.bit, and he noticed it was already taken. So there was a bit message address. He contacted the person who owned it. The person who owned it just said, "Can you please prove that you actually own bitname.ru? And if you can prove that, I'll give you the domain for free." And so he proved it, and he got the domain for free. So yeah, there definitely are some squatters who are trying to, make lots of money and won't give it to you unless you pay. But I think they're a minority. And I think the problem here is that most people who are looking for a domain, if they do find one that's squatted, they just assume that they won't be able to get it without paying a lot. And in practice, that seems to be a false assumption.
Okay, that's great to hear. That should alleviate some of the concerns, and there's a lot of potential here. And then the .bit domain is actually pretty cool. So I'd love to actually get my hands on it and start using it. As far as actually being able to use the domain names part of it, do you need, does Namecoin need to get support from, let's say, a major router manufacturer? Or are you trying to get into the browsers? I know that there was an application, I think it was DNS Chain back in the day, where you could install a Chrome application in your browser or Firefox or something like that. How do you see, let's say, the mainstream use or sort of easier use of the domain name system happening with Namecoin? Yeah,
so one of the things that we're often asked is, why aren't you trying to get, major ISPs or major DNS recursive resolvers to resolve Namecoin on behalf of the user? And the reason we don't do that is because then those entities would become trusted third parties, and they would be able to censor or hijack Namecoin domain names at will. And what we think is a better approach is to release software that can be installed locally on the user's own computer that does the Namecoin resolution and basically converts that into something that applications that use DNS, meaning everything, can use. And then we're trying to get operating system vendors and browser vendors to actually bundle that software with their operating system or browser. And we think that approach is a lot more secure. And in addition, I honestly think it's more easily achievable. And the reason I say that is that the browser vendors and the operating system vendors, when they want to differentiate themselves from their competitors by innovating, they usually innovate by doing things like, adding new security features or things like that. Whereas when ISPs try to innovate, they're usually innovating by finding new ways to exploit their customers via net neutrality violations and things like that. And so I think it's a lot more feasible to get operating system and browser vendors to support Namecoin rather than trying to get centralized third parties to do it. Right. And on that note, we actually have been discussing this idea with various operating system vendors and various browser vendors, and there has been progress on that. There's nothing I can announce at this point, and there probably won't be anything to announce anytime very soon, but we definitely are making progress. There are operating system vendors and browser vendors who are very interested, and it basically just comes down to working out the particulars and making sure that Namecoin meets the needs that those vendors have. So I'm hopeful that we'll actually see progress on that in the foreseeable future in terms of actually getting stuff bundled.
Yeah, that's one of the most exciting things that I saw when I started looking into Namecoin a little bit ago. So it sounds like you can bypass the ISPs, you can bypass the kind of the notaries, I guess. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the organizations we were talking about that it would end up being kind of trusted, domain resolvers. Yeah, but you can get past through the browsers. I think that sounds great. That's very exciting. Looking forward to kind of new developments on that. And you mentioned that you're going to be at this conference in Netherlands. People can find that on namecoin.org. Is there anything else you want to announce or mention that's exciting coming in the near future?
Let's see. There's not a huge amount that's announceable at this point, other than that we do have a port of Electrum, the lightweight Bitcoin client, that is being ported to Namecoin, and so the current release of Electrum NMC only supports currency transactions, but the latest master branch on GitHub actually does support name transactions. There's a nice name management graphical interface, so you can register names, you can update names. It supports looking up names as well, and so that's an interesting approach for people who, for whatever reason, aren't able to run a full Namecoin core client. And we're definitely looking at expanding that in the future as well. In particular, right now it supports Trezor hardware wallets for currency transactions, and we do intend to expand that to supporting name transactions with Trezor hardware wallets. So if you have a very high value name and you want to make sure that malware on your machine can't steal the domain, then the Trezor support for name transactions that will hopefully be coming out very soon, that may be something that is quite useful.
That's awesome. Is there such a thing as multi-sig logic that you can apply to domain names, or time lock logic?
Yeah, so in theory you can. The way that name transactions work under the hood is basically it's just prefixing some extra script opcodes before the pub key script. And so in theory, anything that a Bitcoin pub key script can specify can be specified in Namecoin as well for a name. Unfortunately, right now, Namecoin doesn't yet have P2SH activated. And that's basically just because we never actually had it, got around to setting a flag day to activate it. And so Multi-Sig does work in Namecoin, but not via P2SH. And of course, most of the Bitcoin tooling that uses Multi-Sig assumes that you have P2SH available. We are planning on activating P2SH in the next soft fork at the same time that we also would be activating CSV and SegWit. So hopefully we'll see that soon. Pretty much all the code for that is written. It's basically just a matter of doing the grunt work of contacting major service providers like exchanges, making sure, hey, you guys are able to upgrade in time, right? And then actually just setting the flag day and releasing binaries, and that'll be that. It shouldn't be particularly difficult. I think the reason it hasn't happened yet is just because we've been busy coding other things that we found to be somewhat higher priority.
Gotcha. That's great. I'm very excited about the future of Namecoin. I'm going to keep an eye on it. Any final thoughts?
Let's see. I already give a shout out to NLNet Foundation in the Netherlands, which is funding us, but I just want to give them a shout out again. They do really, really good work funding lots of cool projects out there. If you look at their website, nlnet.nl, you can see a list of all the projects they've funded over the years. Some of them will be very familiar to your audience, things like Tor, CubesOS, things that a lot of people use and rely on. NLNet funds really cool stuff like that. So kudos to NLNet for actually getting a lot of stuff done. And I mean, they don't have a huge amount of money available. It's amazing how much they're actually able to get done, given that they have to be quite frugal.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, NL Foundation. Check out their website, and thank you, Jeremy, for coming on. I appreciate your time, and this has been a fantastic conversation. I hope people will find it useful.
Thank you.